Before we begin, if you enjoy deep research-based explorations into the earliest layers of biblical history, feel free to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm this type of content matters. Today, we return to a subject that stretches beyond time itself, a conflict so old that human language can barely hold the weight of it, yet scripture and ancient commentary preserve its echoes. The story of the first war in heaven does not begin with violence or weapons. It begins with structure, an ordered hierarchy that predates the physical universe. In the oldest layers of Jewish thought, long before systematic theology existed, heaven was understood not as a realm of quiet harmony, but as a place of roles, ranks, and responsibilities. Celestial beings, often referred to collectively as the hosts of heaven, were not uniform creatures. They differed in purpose, knowledge, and authority, much like the varied ranks of a royal court. Archaeological discoveries from the ancient Near East reveal a recurring image across cultures: the divine council. Whether in Ugaritic texts, early Canaanite inscriptions, or the poetry preserved in the Psalms, the idea of a heavenly assembly appears as an ancient and widespread conception. Scholars emphasize that Israel did not invent this imagery. It contextualized and reinterpreted it through monotheism. Instead of many competing deities, the Hebrew worldview presents one sovereign God presiding over a structured host of loyal servants. This council imagery became central to how early Jewish interpreters understood the origins of both harmony and conflict in the spiritual realm. While Scripture itself rarely describes the pre-creation period directly, the cultural background and later Jewish commentary suggest that before the formation of the material world, heaven already functioned as an ordered kingdom. There were messengers, guardians, watchers, and beings assigned to roles humanity would only vaguely perceive centuries later. One of the earliest roles discussed in rabbinic and apocryphal sources is that of the morning stars, a term linked with high-ranking spiritual beings of exceptional brightness or authority. The poetic language in ancient Hebrew portrays these beings not as literal stars, but as exalted figures whose radiance reflected their proximity to the divine presence. Their purpose was not only to worship, but to participate in the administration of the future world. This is where tension first emerges. According to interpretations drawn from the Book of Enoch and later Jewish writings, a plan was declared. A plan involving the creation of a new kind of being, a creature formed not of fire or celestial substance, but of earth and breath. Humanity. This future species would bear the divine image, a concept that ancient interpreters viewed as extraordinarily disruptive. In a realm defined by order and hierarchy, granting unique authority to a creature made of dust introduced a radical shift in the cosmic structure. Scholars who study Second Temple Judaism argue that the announcement of humanity's intended role was the first moment where disagreement could have arisen. Some celestial beings, according to apocryphal texts, questioned why a fragile, earthbound creature should be given dominion over the earth, a domain angels had traditionally overseen. This dispute is not explicitly narrated in the canonical texts, but it forms a critical interpretive layer in Jewish and early Christian traditions. In ancient commentaries, especially those surrounding the figure later associated with rebellion, the arrival of humanity represents a turning point. The question was not merely about status, but about mission. If humans were to carry the divine image, what then would become of the authority previously held by higher beings? Would they serve these new, lesser creatures? Would the hierarchy shift in ways that diminish their roles? The roots of conflict grew not from envy alone, but from an ideological divide. Some embraced the divine plan, recognizing that creation was expanding in ways they could not fully comprehend. Others perceived it as an affront to their ancient dignity and purpose. This tension, subtle at first, would later erupt into open defiance. But at this stage, it existed as a quiet fracture, a disagreement beneath the surface of heaven's ordered structure. At the heart of the narrative is the recognition that rebellion does not emerge suddenly. It forms slowly, through questions, hesitations, and competing visions for how reality should function. The earliest interpreters understood that heaven was not a static environment, but a world of agency. celestial beings were not mindless. They were capable of decision, loyalty, and dissent. This sets the stage for what would become the first war in heaven, a conflict not of swords, but of wills. A conflict in which the future of creation and the destiny of humanity itself would hang in the balance. In exploring the roots of the first celestial conflict, scholars consistently point to a decisive tension surrounding authority. Not authority in the human political sense, but in the deeper, older structure of the divine order, a concept woven into ancient Jewish thought long before systematic theology existed. Early interpreters believed that heaven's hierarchy was not merely functional, it was purposeful. Every being had a role, and every role reflected the wisdom of the one who established it. Yet the announcement that humanity would bear the image of God introduced a question that rippled through the heavenly host. In the poetic language of ancient commentaries, the decree was like a flame placed where only lightning had stood. It challenged long-standing assumptions about responsibility, dominion, and the very meaning of service. To some of the highest beings, the idea that a newly formed creature of clay might receive special honor appeared not only unexpected, but destabilizing. This tension becomes clearer when examined through the lens of early Jewish literature. In interpretations connected to Isaiah's imagery and the writings preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, one exalted being emerges as the focal point. Not yet the adversary figure familiar to later readers, but a high-ranking celestial being whose role placed him close to the center of divine administration. Early interpreters understood him as powerful, radiant, and entrusted with significant authority among the morning stars. According to scholars who analyze Second Temple texts, this being did not initially oppose God, but struggled with the implications of the new decree. If humans were to be granted dominion on earth, what then would become of the celestial beings who had governed the unseen realms? Would their responsibilities change? Would they be required to serve creatures who had only just been formed? These questions strike at the core of the earliest theological debates surrounding the first celestial rebellion. What emerges from ancient interpretations is not a story of instant revolt, but of a gradual internal shift, a changing posture toward God's plan. The narrative mirrored patterns familiar in the ancient Near East, where royal courts occasionally faced dissent, when kings elevated unexpected individuals to new positions. In this light, the heavenly host's reaction becomes more comprehensible. It was not born from chaos, but from a dispute about order. The moment the dispute took shape, leadership on both sides began to crystallize. Texts like Wern Enoch and later Christian commentary present the archangel Michael as an unwavering defender of the divine decree. He did not act from rivalry but from conviction, viewing humanity's role as part of a larger and incomprehensible wisdom. His loyalty would later determine his position at the forefront of the celestial conflict. On the other side, the exalted being who questioned the decree began articulating a different vision. In this alternative view, the celestial host, beings of fire, wisdom, and ancient existence, were better suited to govern creation directly. Humanity, fragile and bound to the earth, lacked the strength and knowledge required to carry the divine image responsibly. This ideological divide formed the framework of what ancient commentators understood as the first disagreement in heaven. The dispute was not merely philosophical. In the language of early Jewish literature, words among celestial beings carry weight. Their declarations shape realities, influence functions, and define hierarchies. When the questioning being framed humanity as unworthy of the role God intended, he challenged not only the creature, but the Creator's will itself. This moment marks the beginning of what scholars refer to as the question of authority. Ancient Christian writers like Origen describe this moment as the crossing of an internal boundary. Not rebellion yet, but the seed of one. A refusal to reconcile personal understanding with divine intention. The ideological divide widened as other beings, sharing similar concerns or influenced by the exalted figure's reasoning, aligned themselves with the emerging dissent. The tension within the heavenly host is mirrored by similar patterns in human history. Whenever a new order is announced, political, social, or spiritual, those invested in the old structure often resist. The earliest interpreters understood that even in heaven, free beings could disagree. Harmony was not enforced, but chosen. Loyalty was not mechanical, but meaningful, precisely because it could be withheld. In this period before open conflict, the host of heaven remained outwardly united, but beneath the surface, lines were forming. Questions were being asked quietly, then more openly. The disagreement that began as a matter of interpretation was quietly becoming a matter of allegiance. The celestial world was changing, and some were preparing for a change far greater than they realized. The turning point in the early celestial dispute was not a single event, but a gradual crystallization of an alternative vision. Ancient Jewish and early Christian interpreters describe this phase as the moment when a faction within the heavenly host began to consider a different structure for creation, one in which celestial beings, not humanity, would guide the unfolding order of the world. What had begun as private discontent now evolved into an articulated ideology. Scholars studying Second Temple literature note that heavenly beings were not merely passive observers. They possessed understanding, agency, and identity shaped by ages of existence. The arrival of humanity in the divine plan introduced a challenge none of them had faced before: the possibility that creatures who had never seen the heights of the heavens might one day hold a unique relational position with God. This idea, to some, was both puzzling and alarming. The being who questioned the plan first, powerful, radiant, and ancient in authority, now became a rallying figure. Not yet depicted in the adversarial form familiar to later theology, he was understood in earlier writings as a leader among the morning stars, possessing a voice others listened to. His message resonated with those who feared the consequences of a reordered cosmos. The issue at stake was not simply pride, but purpose. What would become of their roles, their dominion, and their long-standing place within the structure of heaven? In this context, scholars emphasize the importance of the divine council motif. Across the ancient Near East, divine assemblies were depicted as governing bodies in which high-ranking spirits held influence. Within Israel's monotheistic framework, this imagery was reinterpreted under the authority of one God. Yet the structure remained, and within that structure, dissent could spread. If one influential being proposed a different vision, others could be drawn in, not out of malicious intent, but out of loyalty, logic, or fear. The narratives preserved in books like Wern Enoch describe how a number of heavenly beings began to align themselves internally with this alternative vision. No rebellion had yet occurred, but the unity that once defined the heavenly host was beginning to fracture. Ancient commentators portray this period as a quiet, almost clandestine reorganization of loyalties, an ideological undercurrent slowly gaining momentum. The central argument among the dissenting faction was simple: celestial beings should govern creation directly. Humanity, not yet formed from dust, was perceived as untested and vulnerable. In the eyes of those who questioned God's plan, placing such fragile beings at the center of the future world invited disorder and weakness. They believed they possessed the wisdom and strength necessary to maintain cosmic balance without delegating authority to a new species. This view, however, misunderstood the purpose behind the divine decree. Early Jewish interpreters noted that humanity's role was not based on physical strength or ancient existence, but on divine intention. The image of God embedded within a creature capable of moral choice and relational depth. The dissenting faction's argument, though compelling to some, placed functional superiority above divine purpose. As the ideological divide expanded, the Archangel Michael's stance became increasingly significant. Ancient writings depict him not as a figure of ambition, but as one whose loyalty was grounded in trust. He did not claim to understand the full breadth of the divine plan. Instead, he accepted that creation was moving toward a purpose beyond celestial comprehension. His posture became a quiet but decisive opposition to the growing alternative vision. This emerging divide between those who supported the divine decree and those who questioned it marks a pivotal phase in the ancient narrative. In modern terms, this was the formation of factions, groups aligned not through force, but through shared conviction. The dissenting beings saw themselves as protectors of a stable cosmic order. The loyal beings saw themselves as partners in a divine plan that transcended their understanding. The celestial realm, once defined by unified purpose, now held a growing tension. Each side believed they were preserving something essential. One, the established order. The other, the unfolding will of God. Ancient commentators describe this period as a quiet storm, a moment in which the air itself felt charged with approaching conflict. The rise of a rival vision set the stage for what would soon become the first act of open defiance. The heavenly host had not yet reached the point of irreversible decisions, but its internal balance was changing. And with that change, the first faint outlines of war began to appear. In every ancient narrative of celestial rebellion, there is a moment when disagreement transforms into defiance. Not through violence, not through chaos, but through a single act that reveals a shift in allegiance. Early Jewish and Christian commentators describe this turning point as the moment when one exalted being, long honored among the morning stars, crossed a threshold from questioning the divine plan to openly rejecting it. This transition was not impulsive. In the interpretive tradition surrounding Isaiah's prophetic imagery, the act of defiance was rooted in a deliberate refusal to accept the role God had ordained for the future of creation. Scholars emphasize that this being's greatness was precisely what made the act significant. He was not a marginal figure, but one who had stood close to the center of heavenly administration, entrusted with influence and responsibility. The core issue was not ambition alone. It was the conviction that the divine decree concerning humanity was flawed. In this exalted being's view, the future world should be governed by those who had existed since the beginning, the celestial host, rather than a newly formed creature. The ideological argument had matured into a stance. The plan needed to be resisted, not merely questioned. This is the moment ancient interpreters identify as the spark that ignited the first open divide. According to early Christian writers like Origen and Irenaeus, free will among celestial beings meant that loyalty was meaningful only when chosen. Therefore, the act of defiance held immense theological weight. It was a conscious decision to oppose the Creator's will. This act carried immediate implications for the hierarchy of heaven. An exalted being who refused the divine decree could no longer remain aligned with the order he had once upheld. Ancient literature often frames this moment as a declaration, not always verbal, but unmistakably clear, a refusal to participate in the purpose God had revealed. In some interpretations, this refusal was accompanied by arguments that reinforced the dissenting faction's alternative vision. The reasoning was simple. It seemed illogical for creatures made of dust to be elevated above beings of ancient fire. To those who shared the dissenting view, the divine decision appeared to invert the natural order. The archangel Michael's role becomes more defined in this moment. In Jewish apocalyptic writings, Michael consistently emerges as the guardian of divine intention and defender of humanity's future place. When defiance became open, his opposition solidified. Michael did not act out of personal rivalry. Instead, his stance reflected unwavering trust in the divine wisdom behind creation's unfolding structure. The contrast between the two leaders, one defined by refusal, the other by loyalty, marked the beginning of an irreversible divergence within the heavenly host. Some aligned with the exalted being, who challenged the divine decree. Others remained steadfast in their allegiance to the Creator's plan. The silent tension of earlier stages now gave way to visible separation. This period has been described by scholars as the ideological break. It was the moment when neutrality became impossible. Every celestial being faced a choice: to support the divine decree regarding humanity or to oppose it. The host of heaven, once unified in purpose, now stood divided by conviction. The ancient imagery surrounding this moment underscores its gravity. Whether depicted metaphorically as falling from the heights or symbolically as turning away from the divine light, The act of defiance altered the nature of the being who initiated it. The refusal severed him from the harmony he once shared with the divine will, setting him on a trajectory that would define his identity in later theology. Yet at this stage, no battle had occurred. There were no clashes, no expulsions, no cosmic upheavals. The change was internal, a declaration of independence from the divine plan. But the consequences of this decision were already taking form. The dissenting faction gained clarity of purpose, and the loyal host prepared itself for the conflict that would inevitably follow. The moment of open defiance was the hinge on which the destiny of heaven and earth would turn. From it emerged the first clear division of allegiance, the first challenge to divine authority, and the first step toward a war that would reshape the spiritual landscape of creation. As the divide within the heavenly host sharpened, one figure emerged with a clarity and purpose unmatched by any other: the Archangel Michael. His role in the ancient narratives is not sensationalized or embellished. Rather, it is consistent across Jewish apocalyptic literature, early Christian commentary, and the broader landscape of Second Temple tradition. He is the guardian of divine order, the protector of humanity's future place in creation, and the first to stand firm when defiance became unmistakable. To understand Michael's significance in the first celestial conflict, scholars point to how ancient texts portray the structure of heaven. In writings such as Word Enoch, the Testament of Levi, and various Qumran fragments, Michael is consistently associated with righteousness, covenantal loyalty, and the defense of God's chosen purposes. He is not depicted as a militaristic figure in the modern sense, but as a principled and disciplined servant who embodies fidelity to the divine will. When the exalted being's defiance took shape, Michael's position became a natural counterpoint. Early Jewish interpreters describe him as one who recognized that the divine plan extended beyond the comprehension of the heavenly host. He understood that humanity's role was not a demotion for celestial beings, but a new chapter in a story guided by divine intention. His loyalty was grounded not in rank, but in trust. The ancient motifs surrounding Michael often highlight his steadfastness. In Qumran writings, for instance, he is portrayed as the chief prince who stands against the forces of wickedness, not because he seeks power, but because he safeguards the order established by God. This emphasis on protection rather than domination becomes essential for interpreting his role in the first war in heaven. As the dissenting faction developed its alternative vision, a cosmos governed directly by celestial beings rather than by a new human creation, Michael became the visible anchor of the loyal host. The sources do not describe him rallying beings through fiery speeches or proclamations. Instead, his leadership is portrayed as resolute and unwavering. He stood with the divine decree, and his presence clarified the moral landscape for those uncertain about which path to follow. In early Christian writings, particularly those influenced by apocalyptic traditions, Michael's loyalty is contrasted with the defiance of the exalted being who rejected God's plan. This contrast is not presented as a rivalry of equals. Rather, it reflects two fundamentally different responses to the Creator's authority, one rooted in trust, the other in refusal. Michael's stance made visible to the entire heavenly host that allegiance to God was not simply a matter of hierarchy, but of devotion. This is also the stage in the ancient narrative where humanity's significance becomes clearer. According to apocryphal interpretations, Michael's defense of the divine plan is intertwined with his role as a protector of the future human race. Even before humanity's creation, Michael is depicted as committed to the success and survival of the beings who would one day walk the earth. This pre-human devotion underscores the depth of his loyalty and foreshadows his later role throughout Scripture. Yet the emerging conflict was not defined solely by loyalty and defiance. It was shaped by the response of the broader host. Many celestial beings remained undecided as tensions rose. They saw merit in the dissenting factions' concerns and found comfort in Michael's resolute trust. This period reflects a moment of decision for beings who had existed in unity for ages, a reminder that the conflict was not inevitable, but the result of choices made freely. Michael's presence during this moment of uncertainty helped stabilize the loyal host. His allegiance to the divine decree became a focal point around which unity could gather. The sources imply that his leadership was quiet but compelling, rooted not in self-assertion, but in the wisdom of aligning with a purpose greater than any individual role within the heavenly hierarchy. With the factions becoming more clearly defined, the stage was set for the conflict to move beyond ideological boundaries. The celestial host had reached a point where defiance could no longer remain internal. The disagreement that began with questions and alternative visions was now preparing to erupt into what ancient writers would later describe as the first war ever recorded. A war not of weapons, but of wills, loyalties, and the very structure of creation. As the lines of allegiance hardened, ancient interpreters described the next phase not as a sudden outbreak of violence, but as the widening of a cosmic rift. The host of heaven, once unified in purpose and harmony, now faced a division that could no longer remain theoretical. The dissenting faction, inspired by the exalted being who questioned the divine plan, had grown in number and clarity. Their alternative vision of creation had taken full ideological form, and this new structure could not coexist peacefully with the one God had ordained. In Jewish apocalyptic literature, especially within the traditions surrounding Warren Enoch and early mystical interpretation, the conflict is depicted as spreading across the heavens like a profound moral shadow. The descent did not erupt into immediate battle. Instead, it manifested in the realignment of roles, relationships, and responsibilities across the celestial hierarchy. Scholars who study this period of interpretive history emphasize that it was a war of positions before it became a war of outcomes. The loyal host, led by Michael, remained anchored in trust. They upheld the divine decree regarding humanity's future role and the broader purpose behind creation. The dissenting host, grounded in the conviction that celestial beings should govern creation themselves, viewed the divine plan as an inversion of the natural order. This divergence of vision transformed every interaction into a signal of allegiance. The celestial realm was being reshaped, not by force, but by conviction. Ancient commentators often describe this period using metaphors drawn from the natural world: the first cracks in stone, the first tremors before an earthquake. These images capture the slow escalation of tension. Celestial beings who had once cooperated seamlessly now found themselves standing on opposite sides of a deepening ideological divide. There was no room left for neutrality. The universe was moving toward a moment of decisive confrontation. The war that followed is described in ancient texts using imagery that is symbolic rather than physical. The hosts of heaven did not wield weapons of metal or strike blows in the way earthly armies do. Instead, the conflict is portrayed as a clash of authority, loyalty, and spiritual will. The language of battle in these texts often reflects the struggle for cosmic alignment rather than physical combat. In this sense, the war was a contest of allegiance, a struggle for the shape of creation itself. This conceptual framework becomes clearer when compared with the ancient Near Eastern imagery of divine conflict. In many cultures, cosmic battles symbolize the ordering of the world, the triumph of structure over chaos. But in the biblical and Jewish apocalyptic tradition, the first war in heaven is not a fight against chaos. It is a fight over order, specifically over who defines it. The dissenting faction believed they were protecting the integrity of creation. The loyal host recognized that true order existed only within the divine will. The early Christian exegetes, particularly those writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, built upon these Jewish foundations. They emphasized that the conflict was spiritual, intellectual, and moral. Allegiance to the divine purpose was expressed not through force, but through fidelity. Rebellion, likewise, was expressed not through violence, but through refusal. In this framework, the expansion of the war across heaven represents a tipping point, the moment when refusal gained enough momentum to challenge the established order. The casting down described in later texts, especially in Revelation, reflects a decisive act that followed this prolonged escalation. But at this stage of the narrative, no such judgment had yet occurred. The celestial realm was still in motion, still weighing the consequences of defiance. And this tension, This anticipation is central to understanding the enormity of the conflict. The hosts of heaven, beings of immense antiquity and purpose, now stood in opposition over the very foundation of creation's future. The war expanded because the question at its core could not remain unresolved. Whether the universe would follow the divine decree or the alternative vision proposed by the dissenting faction had become a matter that demanded resolution. The celestial realm, shaped by countless ages of unity, now braced for the first irreversible division in its history. And with pressure building on both sides, the moment of judgment, the casting down, was about to arrive. In the ancient narratives, the moment of casting down marks a decisive turning point, the first time the celestial realm experienced irreversible separation. Up to this stage, the conflict had been ideological, relational, and structural. But with the widening divide between the loyal host and the dissenting faction, the time came when the defiance could no longer remain within the boundaries of heaven's ordered hierarchy. Ancient commentators describe this moment not as a shift in geography, but as a transformation in status, authority, and proximity to the divine presence. The imagery preserved in Jewish apocalyptic literature and later Christian writings often portrays the expulsion symbolically, using language of falling, being cast out, or losing a place in the heights. Scholars emphasize that these descriptions are not literal accounts of a physical descent, but metaphorical expressions of a profound spiritual demotion. The exalted being who once stood among the morning stars now found himself severed from the structure he had rejected. In these traditions, the casting down is an act initiated by the divine decree and executed by the loyal host, typically led by Michael. The motif of Michael leading the charge does not imply physical combat, but represents his role as the foremost defender of the divine order. His opposition was not fueled by rivalry, but by unwavering commitment to the Creator's purpose. The moment of expulsion demonstrates that loyalty is not merely affirmed through allegiance, but enacted through the preservation of divine structure. The fall of the dissenting leader is significant, not because it marks the end of his influence, but because it marks the beginning of a new phase in cosmic history. Once removed from the higher heavens, the place associated with closeness to the divine will, he and his followers became beings whose authority was fundamentally altered. Their rebellion had severed their connection to the order they once upheld, and their presence in the cosmos was now defined by opposition rather than administration. This change in status is reflected in the shifting terminology used across ancient sources. Before the fall, the figure is described with titles suggesting brightness, exaltation, and authority. After the fall, the language shifts toward terms associated with adversarial identity. This linguistic transition mirrors the theological one. The being who questioned the divine plan now embodies the opposition to it. His followers likewise move from positions within the heavenly host to a state of spiritual disjunction. The act of casting down also exposes a deeper theme found across apocalyptic literature: divine restraint. Interestingly, the expulsion does not result in the immediate destruction of the dissenting beings. Scripture and ancient commentary consistently portray the fall as a change of realm and role, not an eradication. This restraint underscores the nature of the conflict. It is not driven by annihilation, but by the re-establishment of order. The dissenting beings are permitted to exist, but not in the place from which they were removed. The reasons for this divine restraint have been the subject of scholarly debate for centuries. Some interpret it as an affirmation of free will and moral responsibility. Others view it as a necessary condition for humanity's eventual story, a story in which the influence of these fallen beings becomes a catalyst for human choice, growth, and moral testing. Regardless of interpretation, the expulsion marks a decisive shift from a heavenly conflict to one that will now intersect with the human world. The imagery of being cast down to the earth, preserved in prophetic and apocalyptic texts, is understood symbolically by scholars. It does not imply that the dissenting beings became bound to physical soil, but rather that they were assigned to a lower realm, one in which their influence would operate indirectly rather than through divine administration. Their proximity to humanity, in this interpretive tradition, becomes part of the unfolding drama of creation. In this moment, the celestial conflict enters a new phase. The dissenting leader and his host, now removed from their former positions, shift from challenging the structure of heaven to influencing the emerging world below. The loyal host, having upheld the divine decree, continues its role in guiding and protecting the unfolding purpose of creation. The casting down is not the end of the war. It is the restructuring of the battleground, a transition that sets the stage for the long conflict that will play out across human history. In the aftermath of the casting down, the celestial conflict entered a new phase defined not by open confrontation, but by divine restraint. The dissenting beings, once part of the structured order of heaven, now existed in a realm where their influence was limited, redirected, and subject to boundaries they had never known before. Ancient interpreters describe this transition as a shift from proximity to distance, not a spatial distance, but a relational one. Their separation from the divine presence was now permanent, and its consequences would shape the unfolding of human history. One of the recurring themes in early Jewish and Christian writings is that God did not immediately destroy the rebellious beings. Instead, their continued existence was allowed within a framework of restriction. Scholars emphasize this as a critical aspect of the ancient worldview. Rather than eliminating opposition, the divine plan permitted it to operate under limitation, ensuring that moral choice remained a central element of the coming human experience. This restraint is interpreted in several ways. Some scholars suggest that it preserved the integrity of free will among celestial and human beings alike. Others view it as an intentional structure that would allow humanity to navigate a world in which loyalty to the divine purpose could be expressed meaningfully. Whatever the interpretation, the fallen beings now operated from a position fundamentally different from their former authority. They were adversaries, not administrators. The shift in their realm is often symbolized through images of darkness, wilderness, or the lower heavens. These descriptions are metaphorical, not geographical. They reflect the diminished status of beings who once stood among the radiant host. Their influence would now be indirect, persuasive rather than authoritative, disruptive rather than governing. In ancient literature, this new mode of activity aligns with the roles of tempter, accuser, or deceiver. Yet this stage of the conflict is not defined solely by the actions of the fallen beings. It is equally characterized by the continued activity of the loyal host. Michael and those aligned with the divine plan remained committed to the protection and oversight of the future human race. In the interpretive traditions surrounding the Book of Daniel and other apocalyptic texts, Michael's role is portrayed as one of guardianship and advocacy, a counterbalance to the influence of the fallen beings now operating in the world below. The presence of both loyal and fallen celestial beings in the cosmos created a dynamic in which humanity would one day become the focal point of the ancient conflict. The fallen beings, limited yet active, would seek to influence the world in ways that aligned with their vision of order, a vision rooted in the belief that humanity was unworthy of the place it had been given. Meanwhile, the loyal host would continue to uphold the divine plan, guiding and protecting humanity's unfolding story. This interplay sets the stage for what scholars often describe as the moral testing of the world. The existence of opposing influences ensures that human choice becomes meaningful. Without these tensions, there would be no context for loyalty, obedience, or moral development. In this sense, the aftermath of the celestial conflict becomes the foundation for the shaping of human history. The fallen being's influence, however, is not depicted as unbounded. Ancient texts maintain that their activity is constrained by the same divine order they once rejected. They can persuade but not overpower. They can influence but not dictate. Their power is substantial, but it is never portrayed as equal to the authority of the divine will or the loyalty of the heavenly host. This tension is crucial for understanding the cosmic landscape in which humanity will eventually appear. As the narrative transitions from the celestial realm to the earthly one, The conflict that began before creation becomes a backdrop for the story of humanity itself. The rebellious beings, cast down but not destroyed, prepare to operate within the limitations of their new domain. The loyal host, steadfast and resolute, prepares to safeguard the unfolding plan. The divine decree remains steady, guiding the movement of history from the heights of heaven to the world that is about to be formed. In this balance of restraint, influence, and purpose, the ancient conflict enters its most far-reaching phase, the phase in which humanity becomes both participant and witness to a story older than the world itself. As the ancient conflict shifted into the realm below, its reverberations began to appear in the earliest layers of the biblical narrative. Scholars often point out that Scripture does not recount the first war in heaven as a single contained episode, but as a thread woven through the entire story of humanity. From the earliest chapters of Genesis to the apocalyptic visions of later prophets, echoes of the primordial rebellion emerge in patterns, encounters, and symbolic confrontations that span centuries. The moment humanity enters the scene, the influence of the fallen beings becomes apparent. In the interpretive traditions surrounding Eden, the presence of an adversarial figure is not depicted as accidental. Rather, it is understood as the continuation of the dispute that began before the world. The fallen leader, limited but active, directs his influence toward the newly formed humans, beings whose role in creation had been the central point of contention. This early encounter becomes the first expression of the lingering cosmic disagreement. Scholars emphasize that these narratives are not intended to portray the fallen beings as omnipotent or sovereign. Instead, they function within constraints set by the divine order. Their influence appears through persuasion, distortion, and challenge, reflecting the same ideological conflict that once divided the heavenly host. In this sense, the earthly story becomes a continuation of the celestial one, carried forward through human decisions and experiences. The Book of Job offers another window into this tension. The adversarial figure's role as the accuser aligns with the post-fall identity described in earlier apocalyptic traditions. No longer a guardian or a participant in heavenly administration, he appears as one who questions human loyalty and challenges the integrity of the divine plan. Here again, scholars see a reflection of the original dispute, a contest over whether humanity was truly worthy of its place in creation. This theme grows more pronounced in the prophetic literature. The visions of Daniel, for example, present Michael as the guardian of God's people, engaged in a struggle against spiritual forces that influence earthly empires. The imagery suggests that the celestial conflict frames not only personal or moral struggles, but also the movements of nations. The fallen beings, acting within their permitted boundaries, attempt to shape history according to their alternative vision. Michael and the loyal host, in contrast, intervene to uphold the divine purpose. Early Jewish mysticism expands on this idea by portraying cosmic conflict as a hidden dimension beneath the visible world. Empires rise and fall, kings pursue power, and nations clash. Yet behind these events, ancient interpreters saw the ongoing tension between loyalty and rebellion. The earthly realm becomes the stage on which the ancient disagreement continues to unfold. In early Christian writings, this theme reaches its culmination in the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation. Here, the ancient adversary is explicitly connected to the original rebellion and depicted as the one who continues to deceive the world. Michael's role reappears as well, once again standing as the defender of the divine purpose. Scholars highlight how this continuity underscores the depth of the ancient conflict. It is not a distant myth or an isolated event, but a framework that shapes the entire biblical narrative. Throughout these texts, the key theme remains the same. The first war in heaven did not end with the casting down. It transformed. What began as a dispute over the role of humanity became a multidimensional struggle expressed through temptation, accusation, influence, and protection. The fallen beings sought to undermine the divine plan by targeting the very creatures whose future role they had rejected. The loyal host, guided by the divine decree, worked to uphold that plan and preserve the integrity of humanity's story. The echoes of the ancient rebellion thus resonate through every major moment in Scripture. They form the unseen backdrop of Eden, the tension behind prophetic visions, and the driving force within the apocalyptic hope for final restoration. The biblical authors, writing across centuries, present humanity not as passive observers, but as participants in a conflict that began before the world was formed, a conflict in which every decision, every moment of loyalty or defiance, reflects the deeper structure of an ancient cosmic divide. And while the reverberations of the First War continue through the story of Scripture, the ancient texts also look ahead, pointing toward a resolution still to come. The ancient sources consistently point toward a final resolution, a moment in which the conflict that began before the creation of the world will reach its conclusion. This resolution is not portrayed as a return to the conditions before the rebellion, nor as a simple reversal of earlier events. Instead, it represents the completion of a plan that was set in motion long before the first act of defiance. Scholars note that the end of the cosmic conflict is deeply connected to the purpose behind humanity's creation and the trajectory of human history. Prophetic writings across the Hebrew Scriptures and early Christian texts highlight this theme. The visions preserved in the book of Daniel, the apocalyptic imagery of Isaiah, and the climactic scenes in Revelation all converge on the idea that the forces aligned with rebellion will one day be confronted directly. In these passages, the loyal host, led prominently by the archangel Michael, stands as a central figure in the final act of the ancient conflict. His role mirrors the steadfastness he displayed at the beginning, maintaining loyalty to the divine purpose when the first descent emerged. The final stage of the conflict, as described by ancient interpreters, is not a prolonged struggle, but a decisive act of judgment. The fallen beings, whose influence has shaped millennia of human experience, will face the consequences of their original refusal. Scholars emphasize that this outcome is portrayed not as vengeance but as justice, the restoration of cosmic order in alignment with the divine plan. The rebellion that began with a question about humanity's worth ends with the affirmation of humanity's place in creation. This theme is highlighted in the closing visions of early Christian writings. The adversarial leader, known by various titles across centuries of interpretation, is depicted as facing a final expulsion that surpasses the earlier casting down. The first fall marked his removal from the higher heavens. The final judgment marks the end of his influence altogether. This distinction is crucial. The ancient conflict does not end when rebellion is suppressed, but when its consequences are fully addressed. In this climactic moment, the loyal host's role is reaffirmed. Michael, who stood firm when the first ideological divide appeared, stands firm again as the divine plan reaches fulfillment. His presence throughout the narrative underscores a central theme. Loyalty is not passive but active, expressed through unwavering commitment to the divine will across ages. The beings who upheld the divine decree from the beginning become participants in the restoration of the cosmos. The culmination of the conflict also sheds light on the purpose of humanity within the ancient narrative. The question at the heart of the first rebellion concerned humanity's role in creation. The final resolution affirms that humanity's place was never an error or an afterthought. The long arc of biblical history, from the early patriarchs to the prophets, from the stories of exile and return to the hope for future restoration, reveals a consistent theme. Humanity was chosen not because of innate strength, but because of a divine intention that transcends celestial hierarchy. This theological emphasis resonates across ancient commentaries. Humanity's ability to choose, to respond, to remain faithful in a world shaped by competing influences becomes central to the unfolding drama. The final resolution of the ancient conflict acknowledges this role. It affirms that the beings who questioned humanity's worth misunderstood the deeper purpose behind their creation. In the final act, the truth of the divine decree becomes undeniable. Humanity is integral to the story, not incidental. The prophetic visions describe the aftermath of the final resolution as a restoration, a renewal of creation in alignment with the divine purpose. The celestial realm, once fractured by rebellion, returns to harmony. The earthly realm, long influenced by the consequences of that rebellion, is restored. The ancient division that began before the world is healed in a moment that affirms the wisdom of the divine plan from the beginning. In this sense, the first war in heaven is not merely an ancient myth or symbolic allegory. It is the opening movement of a narrative that spans Scripture and informs the deepest themes of the biblical story: loyalty, purpose, justice, and restoration. The conflict that began with an exalted being's refusal to accept humanity's place ends with the affirmation of that very place, and with the re-establishment of cosmic order under the wisdom of the Creator. The story closes where it began, with order, purpose, and harmony. But now that harmony is not simply the absence of conflict. It is the outcome of a plan carried from eternity through history to its final decisive fulfillment.